Welcome to our channel, where we set out to explore wonderful, great works of literature.
While dressed in elegant clothing.
Because why the hell not?
not?
So, as you can see, we are in different surroundings, but this is working out for us, I think, for the time being. We might change up the setup at some point in the future,
Welcome to our new abode.
Welcome to our new humble abode. You can see there's some books here on the side, which makes me very excited.
And you can see plants here that make me very excited.
There you go. We set this up perfectly. So we're very excited to present sort of our main feature today, and this is the author. I'm just going to pronounce it.
Junichiro Tanizaki.
Tanizaki. So I'll give a little bit of a brief biography, just for the listeners here. He was born in Tokyo in 1886 and lived in the city until the earthquake of 1923, when he moved to Kyoto, Osaka region. And he actually was awarded Japan's Imperial Prize in Literature in 1949, and he died in 1965. So he lived through this very interesting stretch of Japanese history. So he lived sort of at the end of the 19th century, and he saw all the modern developments and the westernization of Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And so he always kind of took on this, apparently he took on this persona of a grumpy old man, kind of like a curmudgeon-y man, who kind of like shook his fists and always wanted to go back to the traditional older forms of Japan. And so that was kind of the character he embodied in his essays. And so today we'll be covering one of his most famous novels, which is Some Prefer Nettles.
Yeah, which I think in Japanese it's something
So this is a
different.
very strangely different translation than the original.
The original title is Tadeku Mushimo Sukizuki, which translates to water pepper eating bugs eat it willingly. So an equivalent saying in English is each to his own.
So yeah, so it's an interesting jump from one to the other in terms of choice of words, but I think the general meaning is kind of the same. It's like to each their own. Chacun son goût, I guess, in French, right? Each to their own tastes. And then to complement this, we also ended up reading one of his essays on Japanese aesthetics, and it's called In Praise of Shadows, and very much helped inform a lot of the themes in this one by understanding his whole aesthetic view.
Yes.
And they're both fantastic, and they both deserve a read. So let's get into the first one then.
Yeah, let's get into it.
So do you want to?
Let's get into it.
Do you want to do a little bit of a basic plot rundown?
Oh, a basic plot rundown, or like the thing I remember the most about it? Because we read this right before we moved.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I remember. Okay, I'll give a basic plot outline.
Yeah.
From what I can remember.
Yeah.
So generally, it's about this. I don't even know what their age is, but a younger couple.
Kaname and Misako.
Kaname and Misako, and they've been married for I think over 8 years or something like that, and they have a son, and they're just basically in a loveless marriage. Both indecisive people. They don't want to hurt each other. They don't dislike each other. They love each other in a platonic way and care for their son. And they're basically trying to decide whether to divorce or not and how to do it.
And their relationship in this marriage is very interesting because the author uses a particular analogy, and I thought it was so perfect. Almost of two bodies kind of like pressed against a bowl or a basin full of water in between their hips. And so each one is kind of making sure that they're oriented in just the right way so that this water basin between their two bodies doesn't tip and fall. So they're always kind of testing each other out, seeing, do you like this, do you like that, no, okay, and without being direct in any sort of way. And not to really rock the boat, not to create a scandal, not to create an argument. But they just are feeling each other out, but almost like on tenterhooks or...
Yeah. And then it kind of simultaneously, so that's the one plot running, and then on the side there's also the father-in-law, so Misako's father, who is very much embraced older Japan and loves things like the puppet show.
Traditional puppet show from Osaka, right?
Yeah, from Osaka, and he's now living in Osaka, I think. Anyway, but basically he is always trying to express and embody the old, which is becoming, I think, more challenging as modernity becomes and Western civilization pushes in. So he is trying to, in a way, subtly introduce his son-in-law to some of the more traditional forms, but not in a pushy way. Just he's very, very much in love with it, so eager to share these experiences with the main character.
And the father also had somewhat of a loveless relationship, but he now has a new mistress or Ohisa, her name is, and she's much younger than he and him, which disturbs his daughter, of course. But he's made her up almost as if she's almost like a geisha, like almost like as if she is or a doll or a traditional doll. And I think buraku, is it buraku? The traditional Japanese puppets.
I can't remember.
Yeah, maybe it's a different name. But he slowly introduces them to this traditional puppet theater, and through it, you get the sense of the old man's aesthetic, who used to adopt Western ideas and Western eccentricities, and he used to be more of that modernist trend. And then later in life, sort of delved more towards the traditional soul and the traditional art form of Japan. And so Kaname, who's ostensibly the main character, who's in this loveless relationship, he is also tottering between the push between the modernity that's introduced by the West and this old traditional style of the Japanese way of living and the Japanese aesthetic.
Sorry, so the traditional puppet is bunraku.
Bunraku.
Yeah. Okay. Bunraku.
Okay, well, that was close. And so throughout the novel, you see there's this tension, this polarity that's being exercised, not only in Kaname himself, but even in his wife, who also is considered like the new woman of Japan, the one who's adopted Western values and sort of independence and freedom of choice and this like liberation. And
heaven forbid, she powders her nose in public.
Yeah, so there's
like
things like that. So there's clearly a cultural shift that's happening, and Tanizaki as well. Like he's writing a lot from his own personal experience and his own thoughts and opinions about these things, because he did see the transition into modernity. And in Praise of Shadows, I should just quickly add, he does contrast a lot of this this Western idealism of light and illumination and cleanliness and the sort of the dank darkness of older Japan. So that blends into the story. Some Prefer Nettles. But some of the things, let's get into the nitty gritty, I guess.
Yeah, so I think what's kind of fun about this is the translator for this book describes Japanese language, Japanese writing, Japanese poetry as misty. And I really love even that description of their language. So it's not straightforward, it's not factual or to the point.
He made it in contradistinction to the Chinese language.
Yeah. And Chinese storytelling even, where the storyline is very clear. There's not much necessarily left to the reader to interpret. And so we may have totally butchered our interpretation of it, but this is our fun. We had so much fun, especially contrasting the two books and thinking of what maybe was kind of happening that wasn't so forwardly outspoken.
So Tanizaki was also accused quite a bit by other people that you don't go too much into the psychology of your characters. But the idea in Japanese, he says, in Japanese literature is that we don't like to have the word fully express exactly what it is that we're trying to convey. We like a piece of paper, a thin piece of paper, sheet of paper to cover the words from what it is that they're actually trying to convey, right? And he says, nowhere in any of my books, if you've read the books, you should have enough information to go on in order to understand their psychology and what they're actually saying, even if they're not ostensibly saying it on the page.
Yeah. So maybe we want to get started on kind of one of the main themes that we
Yeah.
felt unraveled as we went through.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You start.
No, you start. Okay. Well, I guess like let's infuse this one. Are we going to infuse this one into this one in terms of the analysis?
Up to you.
Okay. Well, like once again, so one of the things that he talks about in his aesthetics is this criticism of the West and their invention of the electric light bulb, and how the electric light bulb was introduced into Japan as exactly that one over there, as a foreign intervention, and had the Japanese somehow come across the light bulb, perhaps they would have done things in a different way. But he says the electric light bulb epitomizes the whole Western mentality. In the way that we walk into a room and we want it to be illuminated. We want every nook and cranny to be shed light on. We want everything to be seen out in the open, clear, full clarity, full sunlight, and with that almost an antiseptic sort of cleanliness about it, something streamlined.
There's not as much of a balance between light and dark as there is. Like it just seems that there's more of an embrace of that in traditional Japanese.
And that's precisely it. So he also talks about lacquered boxes that have a particular sheen to them that only express themselves most fully under candlelight and in the darkness. And so the idea is that the Japanese are not afraid of the shadows. They're not afraid of the dark side. And what that effectively does is that the embodiment of the reality as a whole is more integrated in the Japanese aesthetic than in something that only casts a one-sided view of aestheticism. And by definition, that's almost like embracing, even like on Jungian terms, like your shadow and like the parts of you that you don't want people to see. And we live in such a world where social media like allows us to only show one side of ourselves, our best side of ourselves, without the...
We're very uncomfortable with flaws, with ambiguity, and really with uncleanliness even.
Yeah. And so we could get back to that uncleanliness because there's a particular episode in the book that's particularly striking with regard to this uncleanliness versus cleanliness sort of dichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that Kaname, he had almost like a slight aversion, but also an intrigue with this Osaka and the people of Osaka. So he's coming from Tokyo, and Tokyo they have a particular ethos, a particular way of viewing the world, very cosmopolitan, if you will, right? And Osaka was also always seen as kind of like the mercantile class, like always like merchants who were kind of, there was almost like a seediness, a little bit of like
more expressive.
Yeah, more expressive, but also like a little like a baseness. Like they're not unwilling to mention how much was that suit, or to talk about material things very honestly and openly. That would be considered rather taboo in a more sort of conscientious society.
Less afraid to be upfront.
Yeah, and honest and openness. Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that's necessarily baseness or like vulgarity per se. It's more like there's less nuance in their wording and more straightforward.
Right. No, I meant baseness in terms of like the perspective from a Tokyo person or someone outside of Osaka who would be like, well, that was an uncouth remark,
Oh,
right?
that was like, would they be taken aback by the forwardness of it?
Yeah.
Conversation. Yeah.
And so it's very striking that there is this, in the book, there is this dichotomy between Tokyo and Osaka, which would be more embodying of older traditions rather than Tokyo, which adopts the modern Western views very quickly, right? Mm-hmm. And so there is this tension between the modern and the traditional.
Yeah.
But even with Kaname himself, you said many ways, he behaves very unconsciously, and he makes particular decisions unconsciously, right?
Yeah, well,
talk about that.
Well, what I think for me, the overarching theme was like, you need to always have balance between light and dark. And the irony is that we think when we have everything clear and bright and light, and we think that will be more in control and see more real straightforward things in our life. Like we'll have more clarity.
Yeah.
But the irony is,
And
is
limit
that,
our uncertainty and suffering.
yeah, but the irony is that by avoiding darkness, which includes suffering, by trying to avoid it and hide away from it, the irony is you actually create more internal chaos. So although externally there may be something may be beautiful and clean and that kind of even is embodied in the relationship and to the outside world, you know, this couple portrayed themselves as being very happily married, no one knew there was any problem. Then behind closed doors, that there was still darkness there, despite even to their child, they were hiding all that darkness. And so I guess we can contrast that with the light being almost a conscious decision making and the dark being unconscious decision making in this situation. So if we embrace things like unconscious darkness or our fears, or we shine a little bit light in there might be more balance internally. But what was happening with this couple was they were fighting away all of this, their shadows, and included in the ambiguity and shadow is spiritual components and tradition to Japanese. And so he, without even necessarily being aware of it, he was embracing more Western values, trying to embrace it, but then there'd be instances that because he was so afraid to make choices, he'd be passively making Japanese or spiritual choices. So one example of that would be like the prostitution. So
he ends up going to
the main character ends up going to a foreign escort. So he thinks that this is what he wants. He thinks he wants something more foreign.
And she talks about the escort talks about how she's like from Russia and she's got this very exotic background.
Own, like illusion of personality, right? And but then he closes his eyes and she's very fluent in Japanese, and she's speaking to him in Japanese, and it sounds almost like an old Japanese language. And so he's actually fantasizing about being with an older generation of Japanese, and then he'd open his eyes and kind of be like, what was that about? Not even aware of what his own inner desire was.
Or in other instances, he's riding the ferry, and I found this rather symbolic. He's riding the ferry in the middle of the ocean, and there's two tiers, and the top tier is kind of like westernized rooms, and the other one's Japanese style rooms. And, you know, he ends up going into the Japanese style rooms, choosing the Japanese style rooms almost implicitly.
Yeah. But he's not conscious that he's making these choices.
Exactly.
And so, sorry, go ahead.
No, but I was just going to say about that whole marriage situation, it's like, what's interesting is like, by refusing to make a decision and by refusing to stick to particular choices and break something and have that suffering element come in through any choice that's made, he wants the easy way out. He wants to passively let things decay on their own. So his wife actually takes a lover named Aso.
Which he doesn't stop by any means. In fact,
he condones it.
Yeah, he kind of like passively encourages it.
Yeah, exactly. And he kind of turns a blind eye to it, and he actually tells his wife, well, do a test trial with this guy. If you like him, you can go and you can get married and we can get a divorce and have it all settled. But if it doesn't work out, you can come back to me and, we'll just carry on living our very platonic life together.
Which again is just like a perfect example of, okay, it seems so rational, right? And what is light but a rational kind of conscious choice making?
Yeah.
But then it created so much more chaos in their internal life because she was too afraid. She was like, so does this mean, like, it's this funny dance she was playing, like, does he actually want me still, or does he want me to be with this person? And so it actually created more internal conflict for them both. And in that moment, he made a decision for them both, just very passively.
Yeah. And a response to that, the old man, his father-in-law, writes him a letter and then invites them both over to his place
To try and remedy the marriage. knowledge, but
without really being explicit about it.
Yeah.
He does it very sneakily, very cleverly.
And so in both the father and at one point, this was another choice he made unconsciously, was he invited the son, like must have been his brother-in-law or something. Anyway, it was the child's uncle over, and because he refused to tell his child about what was happening with the child, was very intuitive, an intuitive young boy, so he knew something was off, but he was also, wasn't his place to ask what was going on, so he kind of kept things to himself. And again, it was like very passive of the father to not tell his son that, you know, something is up, and in doing so, the uncle was like disgusted by that, and he was like, you realize you're just creating, basically he was saying like, you realize you're just creating more suffering for everyone by not making any decision, and that's not right either. Whereas, and he was like, no, I think, you know, when the spring comes, I don't want the spring to be ruined, so just kind of pushing it aside. And the uncle's position was like, well, there's never going to be a good time. It doesn't matter if you could rephrase it and be like, if you tell him now in the spring, at least he has the flowers to turn to, right? And so in doing so, again, being passive, he made the conscious choice to force the uncle to tell, rather than what should have been a parent's duty. Really, he forced then someone still within the family, but not within the intimate family, to then disclose the reality and the truth, which was probably in a way also more hurtful for the child, I can imagine. So again, he thinks he's avoiding suffering, but he's not. Right?
And so this one, so leading up to sort of the final sort of culmination, the final shift in the story, when the old man invites Kaname and Misako, his two children, over, he takes Misako out to dinner, and for quite a long time they decide, I think they're going to walk there, or they're going to definitely take the long way to the restaurant.
Can I just stop for a minute?
Oh yeah.
I don't think it necessarily even shifts. That's like the kind of like pinnacle moment, but I think this shift starts to happen when the main character, I forget his name, Kaname, keeps deciding to go to the puppet show. And then he's starting to actually, he's like, wait a minute, I actually enjoy this. I enjoy the kind of vulgarity in that very traditional puppet show, and he's like fascinated by it. And he's fascinated by the dolls, like the puppets themselves, especially the female puppets, and not for their ornate costume, which is not so much in the really traditional puppet plays, right?
They had the older fabrics and the older worn materials, right?
Yeah. Anyway, so I think it kind of started there, but then you're right. The pinnacle and the really unfolding at the end happens when the father-in-law invites them both over.
Can you describe what happens? So
I want you to.
So they end up like the father takes his daughter to the restaurant, and he essentially leaves Kaname alone with his mistress Ohisa, and Ohisa is kind of this. She's been like, I don't want to say trained, but like essentially she knows how to play all the instruments. She knows all the right things to say. She's brought up in a very traditional, old school Japanese manner, and she observes all the old rites and sort of the old traditions, and she's an expert at it.
And she wears her makeup, so she wears like full white face and blackened teeth. Which is shaved eyebrows.
Which is also talked about in Praise of Shadow. We could get to that. We'll get to that point.
We'll talk back to that.
Yeah, and so what happens is, she offers him a bath, right?
Yeah.
And why don't you carry on with that?
Usually he would have said no, and then I think there was some significance there. So the father-in-law is not there. Ohisa is the only presence there, and she's not forcing it. She's not at all saying you have to. In fact, she's saying, oh, I understand why you wouldn't want to have a bath. It might be you're probably not used to this type of bath.
And you should explain what kind of bath this is.
So it's a very traditional onsen, which they don't in this particular one, they didn't clean the water as frequently, and so there is like murkier water in it. And so, for example, like the daughter Misako would not have gone in that because she was more obsessed with like the Western cleanliness
like
and
sanitary stuff. But it's just like it's not like it's water that's been bathed in multiple times by
and there's
different people.
I think they said they put
Clove
cloves
bag,
in it to enhance the smell.
And the room itself is like almost like a thin veneer of light comes in, but it's mostly dark and dank and like earthy and almost like chthonic. There's like some sort of like almost like you're in a cave. You're in like a sacred place that's enclosed. With shadows.
So I think he feels I think if either Misako or the father-in-law were there, he may be more resistant, but her presence made him feel, maybe again it was his unconscious, I don't know, but anyway, he went into the bath, he had his bath, and then immediately after the bath, she's offering him things like, would you like this, or would you like that? And there's this clear shift of him being like, yes, I would like this. And then she goes, would you like, just keeps offering things, and he's like, yes, I would like this. Whereas before, if it was a dance with his wife, for example, it would have been, oh, I don't know, what would you like?
Yeah, very indecisive.
Trying to always put that decision making on someone else. And then, do you want to describe the next scene?
No, you go for it. I think it's quite vivid in your mind.
So then, she guides him to the guest house, whereas before they're like, oh, we're not staying, and then all of a sudden, clearly he's made a decision to stay, and she guides him to the guest house, and he's lying there, and it's dark, and he looks up and he sees a puppet face, and at first he thought it was in the dark, and he thought it was Ohisa at first, and then he realizes it's not, and then it kind of ends with her face, of actual Ohisa's face, coming forward from the dark, and then it kind of ends.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, do you want to describe the significance of that scene?
Yeah.
How you understood it?
Well, maybe that's when we can start to talk about.
In Praise of Shadows, there's a couple of pages where he talks about woman in the ancient Japanese world, in the traditional Japanese world, and this woman, what woman was, the woman who wore like green lipstick or blackened teeth and completely white powdered face, and he said there's something rather numinous. There's something almost like rather
the moon.
Spiritual and sort of moon-like about a woman who's in the shadows of the house, and all you see reflected back at you when you walk into a room is the glowing face of a woman. And that woman represents the moon. And this is very much ancient sort of symbolism across all different cultures, that there is the feminine Luna, right? The feminine moon. And she is the place of sort of the darkness, the place where the spirits are. And she has that close tie with sort of these, with the shadow world, really. Mm-hmm. And if you think about even like in Greek, Hecate, which is kind of like, the Hecate is like the witch, right? Our modern notions of a witch come from Hecate, who was the goddess associated with the moon and nighttime and animals and forests and the things that kind of go bump in the night. Yeah. And so there is that correspondence there with the Japanese traditions. And so essentially what he ends up seeing...
Yeah, so this is how I interpreted it,
and I think it was brilliant.
Right or not.
It was great.
But, so again, my theory is that if that invitation had never been opened for him to go into the father-in-law's house, which was clearly had a lot of spiritual significance, embracing of tradition, and Ohisa, the woman of the house, represented the ancient world, right? Mm-hmm. And they were very much in touch with that aspect, and
spiritual as well as
the spiritual and ancient world. And you can tell in the presence of the father-in-law, he's very decisive, and when, again, like I was kind of alluding to earlier, when you embrace darkness, you actually have more clarity because you relinquish control of the ambiguity and of the things you can't control in life, the vulgarity of life, the unpredictability of life, life that has suffering, life that has disease and germs. And that's where the spirit world lives. And so I think the father-in-law, he just was all-knowing. And because when you embrace what you don't know, in a way, you are more in touch with your intuitive side, and you just know how things will go. So when he invited him, it was like, you will come. And it wasn't forceful. It was just like, he knew they would come. And he knew that when they would go into this, when he invited his daughter out, it would give him the opportunity to go through almost like a cleansing or reverse cleansing ritual, right? Where rather than needing to cleanse himself and become necessarily more pure with light, he entered into a bath that was unclean, old, and came out on the other end embracing more of the spiritual world than he realized, and
more of reality as such, with the combination of dark and light.
And exactly. And then in that embracing of the spiritual world, whether he embraced it, I think it was still all unconscious. He was then more decisive, and then, the representation of Ohisa into the guest room was that, yes, he was more decisive, but again, I think it was more the traditional part of him that became more present in him, whereas before it was really kind of more deeply buried. So it's the unconscious is coming forward more. And he wasn't scared. Like in the bedroom, he was not scared of the puppet. He was not scared of Ohisa in the dark. Whereas all the other scenes up until that point was almost like a fear of his own blood, his own tradition, and his DNA. Of the spirit world.
And like equivalence with the older Japanese values. It was a fantastic work. So just a brief comment on In Praise of Shadows. So this is all about aesthetics. So he talks about architecture. It's really brilliant. He
talks about the medical world and how, if perhaps the Japanese were the first to discover a lot of these medical dentistry, things like the tools might be more comforting for people. Like he's like, there's nothing more terrifying than going to a dentist with shiny implements, like bright metal implements.
Oh, one of the things I want to speak about bright. I really like this idea that he's saying the Japanese aesthetic, we like muted colors. We like, for example, jade and things that have a cloudiness to them, and opaqueness to them. Because
or the elements of light are brought out subtly by candlelight.
Or even that, like reflections where the dance of shadows plays upon the object and animates it in a way. And that the shadow is not the opposite necessarily of lightness, but that it's not like, it's black and white, but the shadow has variegated colors. If you look into a shadowy room, you're not just looking at blackness. You're looking at all sorts of imagery and colors and sort of textures and it's all about textures as well. And like even the idea that he's like, in the West, people polish their silver. I don't know anyone who polishes silver these days.
Actually, my mom still
it's a very English thing to do, I suppose, right? But you polish your silver, but there he said they love the tarnished look. They like things that actually keep their age and show their age.
Become better with age. Change with age, which is again, rather than it's so perfect because it's like, then again, if you think in Western society, we're like rubbing something until it's clean and looks brand new again. Whereas in Japanese, let's let it age and appreciate it's
history
and its ever-changing presence, rather than forcing it to be something new again. It's an embracing of change.
And continuity at the same time, change, but also a continuity that leads you back, right, as well as forward into the future. They're both fantastic books. Do we want to rate these? Okay. All right. What would you give this one?
just because I love everything Japanese, obviously 5 out of 5. That's for all my Japanese friends.
Okay, 5 out of 5. I'll give it a 4.7 out of 5. I think this is like really worth very much top marks. Do you want to talk about a little bit about your experience in Japan?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
The reason why I love it so much is I did live there for 2 years. So,
Yeah.
And I still have wonderful friends there. So.
Yeah, shout out to all of them out there.
And ones who have moved away but are still very close. So it's a very special place to me, and I think, actually, I think there's some kind of beauty here because returning now into, although I'm still in Canada, we've moved away from modernity.
In a real sense, yeah.
And we've moved more to a place where
it's a slower
we
way
can be closer to nature. And for me, although I'm not Japanese, for me nature is kind of more of that embracing of the shadow. Because again, within nature, there's dirt, there's grime, there's germs, and I love that. That's the earthiness is what brings us closer to the rest of the universe, I think.
Yeah. All right, next one.
I forgot we were doing that.
In Praise of Shadows.
I learned a lot, actually.
This is rather new for you because I don't think you've read
I kind of wish
philosophical
that when I
essays
was living there, I read more. It kind of makes me sad, but in a way, it's like, well, now I can appreciate it all over again in a new light, which is very fascinating. I would definitely give it like a 4.8. It's very interesting.
I would give it 4.8 as well. It's really quite wonderful.
Yes.
You learn quite a bit for sure. It almost kind of like rewires your brain.
Yeah.
You know, even when you walk into a dark room, you start to really appreciate it. You don't really want to turn on the lights and sort of have everything perfect. There always has to be that little bit of imperfection for something to be fully real.
Yeah, so just let you know, so we read this one before we moved, and then we read this one after we moved.
Yeah.
And it was like kind of perfect because so we're in a traditional log home that was built in the 1800s, and there's so much imperfection within it, but that's what makes it so beautiful. But again, there's areas that, the lights, it's darker in some areas, and at first when we walked in and we looked through like our Western lens, right? We're like, oh, this area needs more light, let's change our countertops so we have less wood, and then after reading this, it's like, wait a minute, now I actually really love these like kind of, well, to me they're not imperfections anymore. They're the beauty of the natural world, and you can see aspects of light flickering on wood in different areas, and it just makes me appreciate the house in a whole new way.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah, and I would love to go back to Japan and reread this again and see, traditional tatami rooms.
See with the new eyes, right?
Yeah, look at it. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
But anyway, I'm sure there's lots we missed from this, and so if you are Japanese and you're watching this today, what did we get? What did we totally botch and get wrong? Were there elements we actually did incorporate well? And yeah, any insights are always welcome. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.